If you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or made to feel small in your own home, stay with me. This story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming power one quiet, brilliant move at a time. The Christmas table looked perfect. Polished silverware gleamed beneath flickering candlelight. A roast glistened under a glaze of honey and thyme. Claire had folded the linen napkins herself, each one tied with a tiny sprig of rosemary and a crimson ribbon. From the outside, it was the kind of holiday spread that could grace a lifestyle magazine warmth tradition family. And yet, under the surface, something was shifting. The air buzzed not with holiday cheer, but with anticipation Claire could taste at the back of her throat. Ethan stood at the head of the table, wineglass in hand, his reindeer sweater stretched snug across his chest. He tapped the side of his glass with a butter knife. Before dessert, he began, the grin on his face theatrical. "I have a little surprise for my lovely wife." Claire kept her smile soft. She met his eyes across the table. Calm, still. Her sister Beth, cheeks flushed with wine, clapped her hands. "Ooh, something sparkly." Claire gave her a small shrug, a half smile. She already knew. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a white envelope. No bow, no card. Just paper, cold and sterile. He walked it over to Claire and placed it in front of her like he was offering her an award. "Merry Christmas, babe," he said with a wink. Nate, Ethan's best friend, chuckled from the other end of the table, already 2 beers in. No one else laughed. Claire looked at the envelope for a moment. She didn't touch it. Her fingers remained wrapped around the stem of her glass, steady as ever. The room had quieted. Her father cleared his throat. Her mother shifted in her seat, eyes darting from Ethan to Claire and back again. Slowly, Claire set her wine down. She picked up the envelope and slid her nail beneath the seal. Opened it with the care one might give a wedding invitation. She read the first line, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Already filed. Already signed. Highlighted at the bottom, an arrogant little flourish was the section that outlined her lack of response would count as acceptance. As if he'd planned it like a prank. As if her reaction would be his encore. Claire looked up. Ethan's grin widened, cocky and expectant. Nate leaned back, waiting for the show. She smiled. Not the smile of a broken woman. Not the brittle smile she used to give when Ethan made jabs in front of his coworkers. This was different. Serene, even a little amused. "Thank you," she said softly, sweetly. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a silver pen. Click. The room was silent, thick with confusion. Claire signed the papers with one elegant stroke. Dated them. Capped the pen. Slid the envelope back toward Ethan across the table. "Done," she said. Ethan blinked. "That's it? That's it." His voice stumbled, trying to catch up. But before he could say more, Claire reached beneath the table and pulled out a small, gold-wrapped box. Tied with a satin ribbon nestled neatly in her lap all evening. She placed it in front of him. "Your real gift," she said, voice light. He hesitated, glanced around. The whole table was watching. With a tug, he ripped open the paper. Inside a leather-bound folder, he opened it. Read the first line. Froze. Claire watched his face, the slow drain of color, the twitch in his jaw, the widening of his pupils. His mouth moved silently as he scanned the pages. "What is this?" Nate asked, trying to peek over his shoulder. Claire answered. "It's a post-nuptial agreement, signed and notarized, by Ethan. Almost a year ago." Ethan finally looked up. "You tricked me?" "No," Claire interrupted, gentle but firm. "You laughed. You said I was being paranoid. You signed it drunk, thinking it didn't matter. I had it reviewed, witnessed, and filed. All legal, all binding." His hand trembled slightly, the document still clutched between his fingers. "You filed first," he said, as if that changed the terms. "I did," she nodded. "Which makes my version enforceable. Every clause, every asset split, every condition." A silence spread across the table like spilled wine. His mother pressed her lips together, her fork abandoned beside her half-eaten potatoes. Beth stared at Claire, mouth parted. Claire wasn't finished. She reached into her bag one final time and pulled out a thin white envelope. Quietly placed it next to Ethan's untouched wine glass. He didn't reach for it immediately. Eventually, curiosity overpowered fear. He opened it. Inside, a black and white sonogram photo. 8 weeks. His eyes lifted slowly to Claire's. She met them calm and unwavering. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't shock, it was realization. That this wasn't a woman unraveling. This was a woman rising. "You planned this," Ethan said barely above a whisper. Claire tilted her head. "You bet I'd cry," she replied. "You called me predictable." She took a slow sip of her wine, non-alcoholic grape juice, not that he'd noticed, and set the glass down gently. "I didn't plan," she added, gaze steady. "I prepared." It started with laughter. That's what made it hard to name at first. Harder still to fight. "You know I could leave you tomorrow, right?" Ethan would say at dinner parties, one arm casually draped around Claire's shoulder. He'd chuckle as he said it, voice warm, teasing, eyes twinkling, like it was all in good fun. And the room would laugh with him. Every time. So Claire laughed too, at first. But something tightened in her chest every time those words left his mouth. A small knot just behind her ribs, pulling tighter with each echo. She told herself it was a joke. Everyone else seemed to think so. But the joke came often, too often. And it wasn't just at parties. "You'd be lost without me," he said once while she was folding laundry. "What would you even do on your own? Forget your passwords and starve," he added, sipping scotch. She smiled, tight-lipped. Said nothing. He never hit her, never shouted. That was part of the confusion. Ethan was far too polished for anything overt. His cruelty came like perfume, subtle, lingering, sweet-smelling on the surface, but suffocating once it settled in. He criticized with charm. "Trying too hard, aren't we?" he said when she wore her favorite red dress. "You embarrass me when you talk too much in front of my boss," he murmured after a fundraiser. "You're lucky I'm still here. Honestly, Claire, what would you be without me?" Each line delivered with a smile, a toast, a kiss on the forehead. She used to fire back at first. Used to defend herself. Used to tell him she didn't like it when he said things like that. But then came the silence, the chill in his eyes, the withering sigh, and worst of all, the way he'd talk to her the next day like she'd ruined everything. Like she was too sensitive, too emotional, too much. So she learned. Learned to smile even when it burned, learned to nod, to shrink, to disappear in the right places. She started checking his tone before she spoke, started second-guessing her clothes, stopped posting on social media, stopped going to book club, stopped returning her sister's calls. And no one noticed. That's the thing about emotional abuse, it doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't scream from the rooftops. It whispers quietly like fog creeping under a doorframe. Until one day, you wake up and you're no longer sure who you were before it arrived. Claire kept pretending everything was fine. She told Jenny, her childhood best friend, who had once braided her hair on the school bus, that Ethan was just sarcastic. "It's how he jokes," she said one day, after a barbecue where Ethan had made some cutting remark about her spending in front of their guests. Jenny looked at her long and hard. "He doesn't have to mean it," she said, "but you look like you're disappearing." And maybe she was. Claire used to paint. She used to host Sunday brunches, laugh loudly, and restaurants hum while making coffee. Now she measured her movements, timed her tone, walked on glass even when there were carpets beneath her feet. Ethan liked control, but not the obvious kind. He didn't slam doors or throw plates. He reminded her gently publicly that she'd left dishes in the sink when her mother visited. He muttered useless just softly enough when she forgot his dry cleaning. Still, Claire convinced herself this was marriage. Not perfect, but steady, stable. At least he didn't cheat, she told herself. At least he wasn't violent. At least... But those at leasts were the bargain chips she used to stay in place. Each one a discount on her own worth. The worst part, no one really knew. To their friends, they were a power couple. Claire, the supportive wife. Ethan, the successful executive. He'd wrap an arm around her in public, call her his better half with a smirk, and she'd smile like her life depended on it. Inside, she was vanishing. One night, they went to a formal gala. 2 glasses of champagne, and Ethan leaned toward her and muttered, "You're just like the rest of them, always wanting more. Clingy. Needy." Claire froze. The words pierced deeper than she let on. She didn't ask what triggered it. She rarely did anymore. Back home, he slammed the door, made himself another drink, and collapsed on the couch. Claire walked into the kitchen. The dishes from earlier still sat in the sink. She picked them up, methodically washed and dried them, then poured him a fresh glass of scotch. She handed it to him with the smile she had practiced to perfection. Then quietly, almost like an afterthought, she said, "Maybe we should sign something, since you always joke about leaving." Ethan laughed. "What, like a prenup? To protect my fantasy football winnings?" He grabbed a napkin, scrawled something across it, and handed it to her. "Here. Go get it notarized if you're that scared." Then he passed out on the couch. He forgot about the napkin by morning. But Claire didn't. She folded it, filed it, and something inside her, a spark maybe, flared into life. The napkin wasn't even clean. There was a smudge of bourbon near the corner, a faint ring from his glass, and a scribbled signature that curved slightly at the end, the way Ethan's handwriting always did when he was drunk and smug. Claire stared at it the next morning, holding it between 2 fingers, like a fragile artifact from another life. Ethan had already left for work, hungover and unaware. The night before, he'd slurred half-hearted jokes about prenups while downing his 3rd scotch. Claire had offered him another drink with a soft laugh and a suggestion delivered lightly, like it meant nothing. "Since you always joke about leaving, why not make it official?" Ethan had grabbed the closest thing, a cocktail napkin, from the bar cart and scribbled his name on it. "There, go get it notarized," he said, eyes glazed, voice too loud for the quiet of their home. Then he passed out on the couch, like a man who thought he'd just won something. But Claire hadn't laughed. Not really. Not inside. Instead, she folded the napkin carefully, pressed it between the pages of an old cookbook, and went to bed in silence. By noon the next day, she was sitting across from Jenny. Jenny Harper, her oldest friend, now a practicing family law attorney, had always been the no-nonsense type. Even in high school, she'd been the one with a color-coded binder and a plan for every group project. She'd stood beside Claire at her wedding, watched Ethan's charm tighten like a vice over the years, and waited quietly, too quietly. Now she sat in her sleek office reading the napkin through thin-rimmed glasses, lips pursed in a half-smirk. "He signed this?" Jenny asked finally. Claire nodded. Voluntarily, Claire hesitated. Then he thought it was a joke. Jenny removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Good. That makes it even better." There was something sacred in that moment, not vengeance, not even anger, just a quiet alignment of facts and possibilities, of knowing that the walls Claire had lived behind weren't just closing in, they were now mapped. Jenny didn't ask for a full confession. She didn't ask why or how long. She simply clicked her pen open, reached for a yellow legal pad, and began outlining. "We're going to turn this napkin into something real," she said, "something binding." Over the next few weeks, the two of them worked quietly, meticulously. Jenny drafted a post-nuptial agreement, one with clear financial protections clauses, about voluntary signing, asset division, and spousal support. She built it like a fortress, clean, unshakable, airtight. Claire returned to Jenny's office one Tuesday afternoon to sign the finalized document. The notary, a soft-spoken woman with silver hair and kind eyes, sat as a silent witness, stamping and dating each page with the gravity of ritual. Jenny even recorded the session audio and video just in case Ethan ever tried to say he was coerced or misled. Everything was above board, clear, legal. Afterward, Jenny slid the thick stack of papers into a slim leather folder and handed it to Claire. "I've also emailed you a digital copy," she said. "Use the private email we set up for you." Claire had forgotten about that email one Jenny created for her 3 years ago, back when things had first begun to feel off. Back when she still thought maybe things would get better. "They won't," Jenny had said quietly then. "But if you're not ready to leave, at least be ready to land." That night, Claire took the leather folder home and placed it in the back of the filing cabinet behind old tax returns and appliance warranties. She labeled the folder Legal Records, Personal, a bland enough title to draw no attention. She sealed it in a fireproof envelope. Then she did something else, something she hadn't done in a long time. She exhaled. For the first time in years, Claire felt her lungs expand completely. It wasn't liberation, not yet, but it was preparation. It was no longer just surviving the hour or the dinner or the look on Ethan's face when she said the wrong thing. It was planting something beneath the surface, something solid. The next day, she woke early, made coffee, and watched the sunrise spill over the kitchen counter. Ethan didn't notice the difference. He came downstairs, muttered about his meeting, and left without finishing his toast. Claire smiled at his back as the door closed. From that point on, she moved quietly, carefully, not with fear anymore, but precision. She didn't leave, not yet. Instead, she kept living on the surface. She cooked. She laughed at the right times. She nodded when he bragged in front of friends. But behind every nod, every soft smile, was a woman rebuilding her power one page at a time. Some women leave in the middle of the night, clutching nothing but their children and keys. Some leave in bursts, shouting doors, slamming voices, cracking under the weight of breaking. Claire wasn't one of those women. She was a planner, a listener, a woman who knew that silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Because sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't to run. It's to wait, build your parachute, and choose exactly when to jump. To the outside world, Claire looked softer. She laughed at Ethan's jokes again, even the cruel ones. She kissed him on the cheek at dinner parties, wore her hair the way he liked, and asked if he needed anything when he came home late. She folded his gym shirts with military precision and refilled his whiskey shelf without complaint. But behind her eyes, a different kind of order was taking shape. Beneath their bed, tucked under a loose floorboard, was a cheap spiral notebook. No quotes, no flowers, no live, laugh, love. On the cover, just dates, times, and facts. Claire's handwriting had changed since she began using it. Smaller, tighter, less emotion, more precision. It read like this: May 4th. First 27 a.m. returned home, perfume on shirt, slurred speech. May 12th. Receipts from Hotel Linden. Champagne for two. June 3rd. Called me draining in front of colleagues. Smiled when I laughed it off. What Ethan didn't know was that every insult, every late return, every lie she could prove, Claire logged it all. Every entry was time-stamped, cross-referenced, backed up. She'd begun recording calls, too. Not all of them. Just the ones where his tongue got loose, where his ego leaked out through the cracks in his polished voice. And Ethan's ego that had never been small. One evening, while Claire basted a roast chicken, she heard him on the phone in the other room. "She's lucky I stuck around this long," he said, chuckling. "You should see how she jumps when I walk in, like a dog waiting for scraps." Click, record, saved. She labeled the file July 19 Crumbs MP3 and uploaded it to her private cloud drive. Jenny had shown her how to encrypt it. Everything she kept had a digital twin neatly stored, meticulously categorized. It wasn't about spying, it was about survival. Because when you live with someone who makes you feel like you're always 2 steps from losing your footing, you learn to stop reacting and start documenting. At a summer barbecue, Ethan's best friend Nate, forever loud and slick, cornered him near the grill, a beer in one hand and a smirk on his face. "She'll fall apart if you leave her man," he said. "She's too dependent. You've got it made." Claire was 10 feet away slicing watermelon. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just arranged the slices into a perfect spiral and placed mint leaves between them. "She won't know what hit her," Nate added. "Women like that, they're all soft center." Ethan grinned. "I'm telling you," he said loud enough for the smoke and music not to drown it out. "She'll cry. They always cry." Later that night, as Ethan dozed off on the couch, Claire synced his phone data to their shared laptop. Messages from unsaved numbers, a few too many hotel reservations, screenshots forwarded to Jenny's email. She moved like a ghost through their shared life. Silent, present, watching. She started using a planner, not the digital kind Ethan could stumble upon, but a paper one that looked like a weekly meal prep book. In reality, each symbol she drew was a coded map, a small X for nights he came home late, a dot for every lie she could verify, a star for emotional manipulation things, he said with a smile. But that still stung for hours after. To Ethan, she looked healed, settled, even docile. But that's what he wanted to believe. He'd stopped hiding his infidelities. The messages buzzed across his phone openly, now the screen flashing with flirtations from names like M and L. Claire didn't react. She cooked his favorite lasagna the night he left, without saying where he'd gone. He came home late. She greeted him at the door with a smile. "Dinner's still warm," she said, voice gentle. She was sharpening her silence like a blade. Claire began using a hidden audio recorder during long car rides. Sometimes, he'd speak without thinking. Other times, he'd make cruel jokes mimic her voice, or rant about how much she cost him emotionally. Every second was backed up by Jenny. None of it was for revenge. Not really. It was evidence. Quiet power. Proof of patterns. Because Claire had learned something most people never want to admit. Not all prisons come with bars. Some come with birthday cards, shared bank accounts, and "I love you" said with the wrong kind of smirk. And some women don't break, they watch, they wait, and they record every crack in the foundation until the day they decide not to be buried underneath it anymore. 2 weeks before Christmas, Claire woke to the buzz of Ethan's phone, lighting up the bedroom ceiling. He was snoring beside her shirtless lips, slightly parted the faint stench of bourbon on his breath. She turned her head slowly, quietly, and saw his phone screen still unlocked, tilted carelessly on the nightstand. The message glowed in the darkness. "She has no idea. I'm filing Christmas Eve. Want to place a bet on how fast she cries Nate?" There was a laughing emoji, and a gif. A woman sobbing into a tissue played on loop. Claire didn't breathe. She didn't scream, didn't shake him awake or throw the phone against the wall. She simply stared long enough for the moment to etch itself into her memory like frostbite. Then she reached for her own phone from beneath the duvet. Click. Screenshot. Forwarded to the encrypted email Jenny had set up for her over a year ago. The subject line read, "Final Trigger." She placed Ethan's phone back in its exact position, turned on her side, and closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep. The ceiling above her had never felt so heavy. She remembered a quote from one of her college professors. "Some people burn bridges. Others build explosives under them and invite you to walk across." That night, Claire realized Ethan had never just been cruel, he'd been calculated. And worse, entertained. To him, her heartbreak wasn't just collateral, it was comedy. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, thinking of all the nights she cried quietly in the guest bathroom, of all the smiles she'd forced when he called her clingy or too much in front of friends, of all the ways she bent herself small so he could feel large. And now it was a bet. She wondered what the wager was. Money, a bottle of rare Scotch bragging rights at the next poker night. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he thought the Christmas tree, with its ribboned gifts and glittering ornaments, would be the perfect backdrop for her public breakdown. That he wanted his parents, her sister, and even his co-workers to witness the humiliation. That he imagined her breaking like a porcelain doll, shattering in front of everyone. He thought that would be his grand finale. But Claire had read the script, and she was rewriting the ending. She slipped out of bed before dawn and went downstairs, wrapping herself in the soft navy robe her sister had gifted her last Christmas, the only gift that had felt truly hers. She brewed a pot of herbal tea and sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall in faint, delicate flurries. The street was still asleep. The silence was soothing. Across the table sat her planner. She opened it slowly, flipped to the week of Christmas, and pressed her finger against the 24th. She didn't cry. She wrote 2 words in clean, bold strokes across the page, "Execute plan." It was the first time in a long time her handwriting looked like itself, not cramped or tentative, but steady. That morning, she called Jenny. "It's time," Claire said. Jenny didn't ask for context. She didn't need it. She just replied, "Come by at 4. I'll have everything ready." Claire hung up, then sat back in her chair, letting the warm mug soothe her fingers. It was no longer about escape. It was about reclaiming the narrative. Ethan thought betrayal made her weak, but betrayal had clarified everything. She no longer doubted herself, no longer hoped he'd change or apologized for wanting more than condescension and half-love. Let him file. Let him laugh. She wouldn't cry. She would simply place her hand on the detonator he had unknowingly built for her and press. The Christmas table gleamed like something from a lifestyle magazine. Silverware placed precisely. Linen napkins folded into quiet triangles. The roast turkey, golden and steaming, rested at the center like an altar. Claire moved through the dining room like she always had, fluid poised, the perfect hostess in a pale cream dress and soft waves tucked behind one ear. She refilled glasses of mulled wine, gently repositioned the centerpiece, laughed at her sister Beth's toddler's antics. Ethan, wearing the maroon reindeer sweater she bought him last year, carved the turkey with smug precision. His parents beamed with pride. Nate sat nearby, slightly tipsy, whispering something behind his whiskey glass. Claire caught a word. Countdown. She smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was the calm before the storm. Before dessert, Ethan said, rising and tapping his glass with the flat edge of the carving knife, "I have something for my lovely wife." Claire turned her gaze toward him with performative curiosity. Around the table, conversation dimmed. Even Beth's toddler stilled, sensing the weight in the air. Ethan reached into his blazer and pulled out a plain white envelope. No ribbon, no note. He placed it in front of her like a mic drop. "Merry Christmas," he said, grinning. Claire took it delicately, as though unwrapping a fragile ornament. She opened the envelope and pulled out the papers. Her eyes skimmed the first line. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Already filed, already signed, highlighted like he was proud of the work. She didn't flinch. "Thank you," she said softly, sweetly. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a silver pen, uncapped it, signed the document with one smooth stroke, dated it, capped the pen again. She slid the envelope back toward him. "That's it?" Ethan asked, eyes narrowing. "That's it," she replied. Then she reached beneath the table and placed a gold-wrapped box in front of him. His grin returned. "What's this?" he asked. "Your real gift." A few chuckles fluttered around the table, unsure. Nate leaned forward. Ethan tore into the wrapping, pulled out a leather folder, and flipped it open. Silence. A stillness fell like a dropped curtain. Claire watched as the confidence drained from his face. His lips parted. He reread the first page. Then again. This is legally notarized," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Signed freely. Witnessed. On record." "You tricked me," he whispered. "No, you offered it," she said. "You were drunk, arrogant. You laughed and said, 'Go get it notarized.' So I did." His fingers tightened around the folder. "I filed first, Ethan, yesterday, with that document, under your terms." Nate turned to him, stunned. Ethan couldn't meet his eyes. Claire reached into her clutch once more and placed a smaller envelope beside the leather folder. Ethan stared at it. He didn't touch it. So Claire opened it for him, sliding the contents toward his plate. A sonogram. "I'm pregnant," she said, 8 weeks today." The only sound was the faint crackle from the fireplace. Beth's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing it. Supportive. Steady. Ethan stared down at the black and white image. His mouth opened and closed like a man underwater trying to speak through pressure. "You planned this," he said finally, barely audible. "No," Claire replied. "I prepared." The air seemed to shiver around the table. His mother's fork clinked against her plate. His father adjusted his glasses, though they were already perfectly aligned. Nate leaned back in his chair, visibly paling. Beth's husband reached for the wine again and thought better of it. "You thought I'd cry?" Claire said, eyes locked on Ethan. "That I'd beg. But that version of me died quietly a long time ago." Ethan picked up his phone, perhaps seeking a lifeline. It buzzed in his hand. He blinked. One new email. From Jenny's firm. Subject line, post-nup confirmation. Legally binding. Effective. Final. His face paled further. The corners of his mouth twitched. He scrolled with a trembling thumb. Attached a PDF. Metadata. Time-stamped. Witnessed. Signed. You said I'd be nothing without you. Claire continued, her voice still soft. Turns out, I'm everything without you. She stood and began clearing the table, not hurriedly, but with grace. No yelling, no sobbing, just power. Pure and measured. As she reached for Ethan's untouched slice of pie, she paused. Oh, she said lightly, I'll be changing the locks tomorrow. He sat frozen, surrounded by the remnants of his own downfall. A post-nup, a sonogram, a silence that would echo for years. Claire served herself a slice of apple pie. The cinnamon warmed the crust buttery. She took a bite and smiled. It was the first Christmas in years she could taste everything. By morning, Ethan was gone. No note, no phone call. Just silence. The front door was locked from the inside. His keys were missing from the hook. His presence, so loud, so looming for so long, had vanished like a storm that never apologized for tearing through. Claire stood in the foyer holding her mug of coffee and listened to the stillness. It wasn't eerie. It was liberating. She took a deep breath. No footsteps upstairs, no rustling paper, no voice behind her critiquing the way she held the mug or left crumbs near the toaster. Just her. And the hum of the heater warming the cold tiles under her bare feet. By 9 a.m., she had a locksmith on the phone. Emergency or standard rekeying, the man asked. Claire paused, then smiled. Standard. But make it fast. That afternoon, a quiet man with soft eyes arrived. He didn't ask questions when she handed him Ethan's keys and simply said, "Make sure none of these work anymore." He nodded. When he left, Claire stood at the door with a new key in her hand and realized something profound. This tiny sliver of metal was the first thing she had owned alone in years. Not the house, not yet, but the feeling, the certainty. That night she moved into the master bedroom. It still smelled like him, that crisp, expensive cologne he insisted on wearing. She opened every window, let the December wind sweep through, wild and unapologetic. She stripped the bed down to the mattress, tossed the sheets into black trash bags, dusted off a box of sandalwood candles from the closet, the ones he used to claim gave him headaches. She lit 3, watched the flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, soft, golden. The next morning she brewed her favorite coffee, the kind he always said tasted too floral. She sipped it slowly, letting it coat her mouth. Her shoulders relaxed, her jaw unclenched. One small rebellion at a time, she took her life back. She bought lavender soap and filled the bathroom with it. She played Nina Simone while making breakfast. She sat on the sunroom floor, barefoot, sorting baby name cards Jenny had left on the kitchen island. Sticky notes still attached with silly notes like "No Tiffany," "Middle school trauma," "Long story." And then one evening she felt it, a flutter. So light she thought she imagined it. But then again, a tiny thump inside her. Claire dropped the dish towel in her hand, both palms flying to her belly. There it was. Again. Her baby, moving, alive. She laughed, breathless and stunned tears springing into her eyes like a faucet she hadn't touched. It wasn't just a kick. It was a message. You're not alone. Later that night, curled under a knit blanket, she opened her journal, the one with the leather cover and thick ivory pages. She wrote slowly, deliberately. This baby will never hear yelling behind a door. This baby will never feel their worth depends on someone else's mood. This baby will not grow up thinking love means walking on glass. And neither will I. She underlined the last sentence twice. The days passed quietly. Mail arrived, some addressed to Ethan, stamped "Final Notice." She stacked them neatly by the front door, untouched. Jenny called every few days, her voice bright with both victory and concern. He called his lawyer again today, she said once, wants to renegotiate. But with the post-nup in place, he's... Stuck. Claire didn't gloat. She just nodded, sipped her tea, lit another candle. Healing didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like clean sheets. Silence. Choosing which tea to drink without a comment being made. Claire didn't rush to redecorate or reinvent herself. She repainted one wall in the nursery, sage green again, soft and soothing. Hung tiny string lights around the window. Bought herself new bed sheets white with tiny gold stars. Slept diagonally, taking up space just because she could. Her world had gotten smaller, but it had also gotten warmer and quieter and more hers. And sometimes in the evenings, she'd sit on the porch with a blanket over her legs, the wind brushing her cheeks, and she'd whisper to her belly, "You're safe now. We both are." Spring came slowly that year, not with bursts of blossoms or cinematic sunshine, but with little changes, the kind you almost miss, until one day you wake up and realize the frost is gone. Beth moved in first. She arrived with her toddler, a car full of groceries, and a firm declaration, "You're not doing this alone." Claire didn't argue. She simply hugged her sister at the doorway a little longer than usual. A week later, Jenny started dropping by after work. Sometimes with takeout, sometimes with herbal tea. Always with that knowing smile, the one that said, "I've got you even in the silence." They didn't talk about Ethan, not unless Claire brought it up. And she didn't. Not much. That part of her life had receded like a tide that left the shore cleaner. The baby's room took shape slowly, intentionally. Claire painted it herself soft yellow this time, not because it was gender neutral or trendy, just because it made her feel calm, warm. She chose every piece of furniture with care. A second-hand crib she sanded and stained with her own hands. A rocking chair that arrived in a box so complicated, Beth nearly declared war on the instructions. They ended up building it over midnight laughter and shared stories, toddler asleep in the next room. Jenny brought over books, baby names, parenting guides, even a journal titled "First Year, First Everything." Claire opened it one evening and began to write. Not for the baby, but for herself. Notes about hope, gratitude, plans. On the front page she scrawled, "This time every choice is mine." Each day brought something new, a stretch mark, a craving, a song she found herself humming without thinking. And each day the house transformed. Not with expensive renovations or magazine-worthy decor, but with meaning. Lavender-scented dish soap by the sink. Sunlight pouring through curtains she chose without compromise. Silence, not the heavy, anxious kind, but the soft hush of a home where peace had taken root. Then one Sunday, while cleaning out the hall closet, Claire found a box. It had been wedged behind a stack of winter blankets and old photo albums. She knew what it was before she even touched it. Her wedding box. The ivory satin ribbon was still neatly tied, dust barely touching the edges. She sat down on the living room floor, legs crossed like a child, and untied it. Inside photographs, vows, pressed flowers. A napkin from the reception. A menu card. That smile she wore when she still believed this was forever. She flipped through them quietly. No tears, no anger, just a soft ache. Like touching something once sharp, now dulled by time. She picked up a photo of herself in the white lace dress, eyes wide with hope, back straight, shoulders square, unaware of all that would come. Claire didn't rip it, didn't burn it. She slid the photos into separate envelopes, labeled the box to release. The next morning she drove to the donation center, handed it over without fanfare. No monologue, no last-minute doubts. She walked out lighter. At home that night she lit a candle, one of the lavender ones she now burned freely, and opened a new journal. Not the one for the baby. This one was for her. The cover was leather, the pages thick and welcoming. She titled the first page, "Plans That Are Only Mine." She wrote in it every night. Sometimes just a sentence, "Paint the kitchen cabinets." Other nights, whole paragraphs. Start over doesn't mean erase. It means redefine. It means I get to choose the story now. Beth would peek in occasionally, always with a cup of tea, or a bowl of sliced fruit. She never asked what Claire wrote. She didn't need to. Jenny stopped by the next weekend, arms full of groceries and a bouquet of peonies. No note, she said. Just thought they belonged on your table now. Claire placed them in a ceramic vase, one she bought on a whim at a local market, the kind Ethan used to roll his eyes at. She arranged them with care, then stepped back. The dining room looked different now, not because of furniture, but because the air felt open, unafraid. It was the small things, the lavender soap, the peonies, the way her body changed and grew without apology, and the way her friends stayed, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, steadily, like the rhythm of her own breath returning. That's what healing looked like. Not grand declarations, not vindication. Just this, a house that smelled of lemon balm and candle wax, a journal filled with first-person futures, and a baby growing stronger with each sunrise. Claire didn't need to forget the past. She just didn't have to live there anymore. The snow fell gently that morning, soft, almost theatrical flakes, the kind that hung in the air like they were in no rush to reach the ground. Claire stood at the window, coffee in one hand, her daughter in the other. Wrapped in a pale pink onesie and a knitted hat from Beth, the baby was dozing against her chest, her tiny mouth forming silent dreams. It was Christmas morning, 1 year to the day since everything broke, and then rebuilt. In the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon rolls filled the air. The good kind, the ones Jenny insisted on bringing over every Christmas now. Beth was humming along with the radio, quietly stirring hot chocolate on the stove, while her little boy ran in socked feet across the wooden floor. The tree this year was smaller, but every ornament meant something. A crocheted baby rattle, a Polaroid of the first night Claire held her daughter in the hospital, her eyes puffy but smiling. An ornament with the word peace burned into smooth wood hung in the center, like a quiet declaration. Claire turned away from the window, adjusting her daughter's weight in her arms. The baby stirred, blinked up with wide brown eyes, then gave a gurgling coo that melted the last ice off Claire's heart. She walked toward the fireplace. The flames crackled gently, warm and inviting. She sat down on the rug, placed her daughter across her lap, and let herself feel it all. Not the pain that had gone quiet long ago, but the fullness, the softness, the astonishing stillness that comes when you're no longer fighting to be seen. Across the room, a picture hung by the bookshelf, not of a wedding or a family portrait, but of Claire and her daughter wrapped in a blanket under a summer oak tree. Just the two of them. Light pouring in from behind like they were kissed by some invisible grace. Beth came and sat beside her, handing her a fresh cup of tea. "Remember last Christmas?" Beth asked gently. Claire laughed softly. "I remember the silence." Jenny joined them, cinnamon roll in hand, a smug grin on her face. "I remember the look on Ethan's face." They all laughed now. Not bitterly, not with venom, just as women who had survived something. Claire took a sip of her tea and looked at the tiny girl in her lap. She brushed a thumb along her daughter's cheek, marveling at how someone so new could feel like the oldest truth in her life. And then the words came back, not from the warmth, but from the ghost of a cold December long gone. "You'll be nothing without me." Ethan's voice cocky and sharp like a blade disguised as a compliment. She hadn't thought about that line in months, but now it drifted through her memory like an echo. She looked down at her daughter again, her whole body softened. And then for the first time she said it aloud, not to anyone in particular, not to prove anything, just the truth. "Turns out," she whispered, "I'm everything without him." Her daughter kicked her tiny legs in response, making a soft squeal that made the whole room smile. There were no papers on the table today. No post-nup folders, no monologues, no dramatic exits. Just a baby. A tree. A home filled with gentle noise laughter, cinnamon stories being retold. Claire stood slowly, her daughter now awake and reaching up to tug at her hair. She kissed her forehead and walked toward the table, joining the small circle of people who never once gambled with her pain. They passed plates, shared small moments, took photos they'd send in group texts and laugh at later. And no one mentioned Ethan. Not because they were afraid, but because his absence no longer mattered. The wounds he left had already grown over. They had become skin again. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the kids had finally been coaxed into naps, Claire sat on the couch alone for a few moments, her daughter tucked against her chest once more. She looked out the window again. The snow had stopped. Just a blanket, now soft and clean, covering everything old. She pulled the blanket tighter around them both and whispered, "We're home." And she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because the tears had long since been turned into something else. Strength, peace, plans that were only hers.